Jake's small garage was eerily quiet, the only sound being the hum of his old fridge in the corner. It was late, much later than usual, and the rain outside was coming down in sheets, tapping gently on the windows. He wiped his hands on a rag, taking a slow breath after a long day of repairs. The smell of oil and rubber hung in the air, and for a moment, Jake felt the weight of solitude on his shoulders. He didn't mind it, really. It was just him and the machines. But tonight, something felt off. He glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. The lights flickered once, then went out completely, plunging the garage into darkness. Jake cursed softly, pushing himself up from the workbench. He knew the wiring had been a mess since the storm earlier, but he had been too busy to fix it. Groaning, he made his way to the fuse box, the wet floor beneath his boots slick and cold. Just as he reached out for the switch, a soft sound caught his attention, a faint rustling from the far corner of the garage. Jake froze. His mind raced. It wasn't the wind. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. A shiver ran down his spine. He wasn't alone. His heart pounded in his chest as he reached for the flashlight on the shelf above him. The beam cut through the dark, illuminating the rows of tools and half-finished car parts, but it didn't explain the noise. Another rustle. Louder this time. Closer. "Who's there?" Jake called out, his voice thick with caution. His hand instinctively went to the wrench on his belt, the only weapon within arm's reach. He knew it was probably nothing, a stray animal or some kids messing around. But the hairs on the back of his neck stood up. The rustling stopped. Jake's breath hitched. The silence that followed felt suffocating. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the sense of dread that clung to him. He took a step forward, slowly, cautiously, the flashlight beam bouncing around the cluttered garage. That's when he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the shadows, crumpled on the floor behind a stack of boxes. At first, he thought it was a person, maybe someone who'd passed out in the storm, but as he stepped closer, he realized it wasn't human. The figure was sprawled awkwardly, a faint glow emanating from its skin, casting strange blue light on the walls. Her clothes were torn, as if she'd been through some kind of struggle, and her breathing was shallow. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he knelt down beside her, cautiously placing the flashlight on the ground to get a better look. She wasn't just not human. She wasn't like anything he had ever seen before. Her features were sharp, almost too symmetrical, and her skin shimmered in the dim light, as if the very surface of her body was alive. Her hair, if it could be called that, was silver, flowing in strange, fluid patterns, and her eyes, when they fluttered open, they were an unsettling shade of violet. She gasped, her chest rising and falling with effort, her eyes locking onto Jake's in sheer panic. Jake backed up slightly, a rush of adrenaline surging through him. What was she? Was she injured? "Hey, are you okay?" Jake said, his voice surprisingly steady despite the whirlwind of questions in his head. His instincts told him to run, to stay away from the stranger who clearly didn't belong, but something kept him rooted in place. There was something vulnerable about her. Her breathing was erratic, and her hand reached weakly for him, but she couldn't seem to find the strength to make it. Jake glanced around the garage. He wasn't equipped to deal with this. He was just a mechanic. But the woman, this strange, alien woman, was in trouble. He couldn't leave her here. "You need help," he muttered under his breath. He didn't know if she could understand him, but something told him she would. Slowly, he helped her sit up, supporting her back as she winced in pain. Her skin was cool to the touch, almost unnaturally so, and her breath came in shallow gasps. Her eyes blinked several times, focusing on him, but there was no recognition, no words, just fear. He reached for his phone, trying to think of someone he could call, but his mind raced too fast. What if she was a criminal? What if this was some kind of setup? His mind was already spinning, but before he could think any further, the woman's hand shot out, gripping his wrist tightly. Her strength was surprising, and for a moment, Jake was frozen by the intensity of her gaze. I, no time, she rasped, the words coming out choked, barely audible. Jake furrowed his brow, not understanding what she meant. What do you mean? Who are you? What happened? He asked, though his voice was filled more with confusion than concern. But there was no time for answers. Her grip tightened, her breathing more frantic now. Then, as if on cue, the sound of a distant engine hum filled the air. It was faint at first, but as it grew louder, Jake's heart sank. It wasn't the rain. It wasn't the wind. It was something else, something foreign. And the woman, her eyes went wide in fear, her body trembling as the sound neared. "They're coming," she whispered, barely audible, but the words sent a chill down Jake's spine. He wasn't sure if she was talking to him or to herself. He could hear it now, the distinct hum of engines, cutting through the storm. They were getting closer. Jake felt his pulse quicken. His eyes darted around the room, searching for any way to hide or escape. What was going on? What kind of trouble had this woman brought with her? He grabbed the flashlight, shining it around the garage. His gaze landed on the old work truck in the corner. Maybe they could hide in there. Or maybe he could drive her somewhere. The woman's eyes locked on him, and she shook her head weakly. No time," she repeated. They'll find us. You need to run." Jake stood up, his mind racing. There was no time to think. He didn't know who or what was coming for her, but he couldn't just leave her to face it alone. With a quick, decisive motion, Jake hoisted the woman into his arms. Her body was light, almost fragile in his grip, and he could feel her shivering. He didn't know who was chasing her, but he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't about to let her go. The garage door creaked, and in the distance, a low hum filled the night air, signaling that the storm wasn't the only threat to them now. The fear in the woman's eyes was unmistakable, and Jake knew that whatever was coming wasn't something he could fight alone. But for now, there was only one thing left to do. Jake's heart raced as he sprinted through the rain-soaked streets, the woman's weight still light in his arms despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He wasn't sure where he was going, but every instinct in him screamed to run. The distant hum of the engines grew louder, pressing in from all sides. He didn't know what kind of trouble he had gotten himself into, but he couldn't stop now. There was something about this woman, a pull he couldn't explain. Something made him believe he couldn't leave her behind, no matter how strange or dangerous she was. He ducked into a narrow alley, his boots splashing through the puddles that seemed to appear from nowhere. He heard the engines now, unmistakable, close, too close. Sweat trickled down his forehead, mixing with the rain. His breath came in shallow bursts as he glanced around for somewhere to hide. The alley was too open. He couldn't risk it. He spotted a small rundown building at the end of the alley. Its windows were boarded up, and the door seemed slightly ajar. It wasn't much, but it was better than nothing. Jake moved toward it, his legs burning with each step. The woman in his arms stirred, her grip weak but firm. "Please," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Hide. Don't let them find us." Jake didn't hesitate. He pushed open the door and stepped inside. The interior was dark, damp, and smelled of mildew, but it was a safe enough place for the moment. He carefully lowered the woman onto a stack of old crates near the back of the room, her body trembling more with each passing second. She looked up at him, her violet eyes wide with fear and desperation. Jake could see the panic in her face, but there was something else there too, something softer. She wasn't just an alien. She was someone in trouble, someone in need. "I don't know who they are," Jake said, his voice soft, "but I'm not going to let them hurt you." The woman's lips trembled, but she managed to sit up, her body still shaking. "I don't know how long we have," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "They won't stop until they find me." Jake didn't need to ask who they were. He had a pretty good idea. The way she had reacted to the sound of the engines, the panic in her voice. This wasn't just some random chase. Whoever was after her was dangerous. He needed to know more, but he also knew he had to stay focused. "Who are they?" Jake asked, kneeling down in front of her. "Why are they after you?" The woman hesitated, looking over her shoulder as if expecting someone to burst through the door at any moment. Her face was a mask of fear, but it softened slightly when her gaze met his. She seemed to gather herself for a moment, taking a shaky breath. "My name is Solara," she said, her voice steadying. "I'm from a place far beyond your world. My people, they are not kind. They've come for me because I betrayed them." Jake felt a chill run through him at her words. Betrayed who? The thought of an alien race coming after her sent his mind spinning. He had heard rumors, stories about extraterrestrial races, but never had he imagined he'd be caught up in something like this. "Betrayed them," he repeated, trying to wrap his head around it. "What did you do?" Solara's eyes flickered with sadness, and she bowed her head slightly. "I didn't want to, but I had no choice. They are powerful, and they control everything. I was one of their own, but I couldn't stay silent any longer. I had to warn others. I had to help." Jake frowned. This was more than he had expected. Solara wasn't just running from some random group. She was running from an entire civilization. And she had betrayed them, risked everything, even her life, to go against them. But why? What could have been so bad that she would risk it all? "You're safe here for now," Jake said, forcing his thoughts back to the present. "But you need to tell me everything. If you want me to help you, I need to know what I'm dealing with." Solara nodded slowly, still watching the door with a wary eye. "They're coming for me because of what I know. They have plans that could change everything. The way they control entire systems, the way they manipulate everything. It's dangerous." Jake's mind raced. He had no idea what she was talking about, but whatever it was, it sounded serious. She wasn't just some runaway. She was someone who had uncovered something huge, something worth risking everything. "But why are you telling me all this?" Jake asked, his brow furrowing. "Why trust me?" Her eyes met his, and for a moment, there was a flicker of something human, a look of vulnerability. She reached out with a trembling hand, touching his arm lightly. "Because I have no one else," she said quietly. "You're the first person to help me, the first one to not turn away." She paused, her eyes searching his. "I don't know why you're helping me, but I'm grateful. And I don't know what will happen next, but I won't let you regret it." Jake stood there for a moment, not sure what to say. His heart was pounding in his chest, but it wasn't just from the fear of the unknown or the danger closing in. It was something else, something deeper. He didn't know this woman, didn't understand her world or what she had been through, but he could see the sincerity in her eyes. The fear, the hope. Something about her felt real, and he couldn't just turn away. "I'm not leaving you," Jake said, the words surprising him. "We'll figure this out together." Solara nodded, her eyes filling with gratitude. She seemed to relax a little, as though the weight of her fear had lessened slightly. The silence between them stretched on for a while, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was as if they were two strangers in an uncertain world, but they had a connection now, a shared moment of trust. As they sat there in the quiet, the sound of the engines outside grew louder again, the rumble vibrating through the walls of the old building. Jake stood, his instincts kicking in. He moved to the window and peered outside. "Whoever they are, they're getting closer," Jake muttered, more to himself than to Solara. He could see dark shapes moving in the distance, lights flashing through the rain. It wasn't long before the sound of footsteps echoed down the alley. Solara's eyes widened in fear. "They're here. We need to leave. Now." Jake's heart skipped a beat. It was too late to run. They'd be cornered. But there was no other option. They needed to act fast, or they would be caught. Without thinking, Jake grabbed Solara's hand, pulling her toward the back door. He had no plan, no idea where they would go or how they would get out of this mess. But for some reason, none of that mattered. Not now. They had each other, and that was enough to fight for. The moment Jake pulled open the back door, the chill night air hit him, and his instincts screamed at him to move quickly. He could feel Silara's grip tightening on his hand as they stepped into the shadows of the alley. They couldn't stay here, not with the enemy getting closer by the second. "Which way?" Jake whispered, his eyes scanning the darkened street, searching for an escape. Silara's breath came in shallow gasps. She was visibly shaken, but she didn't hesitate. She tugged him towards the left, her pace quick but careful. "This way. There's a safe house not far from here," she said, her voice low and urgent. Jake nodded, trusting her despite the knot of uncertainty tightening in his gut. His heart raced with each step they took. His mind kept spinning with questions. Who were these people after her? What had she uncovered? And why did it feel like his life had just taken a sharp turn into a nightmare? As they moved through the winding streets, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. The streets, normally quiet at this hour, felt unnaturally still. The air was thick with tension, and every sound felt amplified. A distant siren echoed through the city, but it was too far to be of any immediate concern. Jake kept his focus on Silara, watching her closely. She was calm on the outside, but he could see the flickers of fear in her eyes. Finally, they reached a narrow building nestled between two larger structures. The windows were dark, and the door was tucked away, hidden from view. Silara knocked twice, a quick, rhythmic pattern. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing a man standing in the shadows. "You brought her here?" the man asked, his voice hushed but with an edge of disbelief. "I had no choice," Silara replied, her voice steady despite the unease that hung in the air. "We're not safe. We need shelter." The man studied Jake for a moment, then stepped aside, allowing them both to enter. Jake felt a wave of unease wash over him as he stepped into the dimly lit room. The walls were lined with old furniture, and the air smelled of stale coffee and something faintly metallic. There was no warmth here, no comfort, just the stark feeling of being in hiding. Once the door was closed behind them, the man turned and addressed Silara, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They'll be here soon. You shouldn't have come back, Silara. You know what's at stake." Silara's face hardened. "I didn't have a choice. I couldn't let them destroy everything." Jake looked between them, confused. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. "Who are they? Why is everyone after you?" The man's gaze shifted to Jake, and there was something in his eyes that spoke of a deep, unspoken truth. He sighed, as if weighing the decision to speak. "The people after you," the man began, his voice low, "are not just any enemies. They're part of a larger organization. An empire, if you will. An empire that has been pulling the strings of not just this planet, but many others across the galaxy. They've been in control for centuries. Their technology, their influence, it's all-encompassing." Jake's mind raced as the word sunk in. An empire. Across the galaxy. It sounded insane, like something out of a movie, not real life. But the look in the man's eyes, the desperation in Silara's face, it all felt too real to ignore. "Why would they come after you?" Jake asked, still not understanding. Silara's eyes softened as she met his gaze. "Because I know too much. Because I've seen things they don't want anyone to see. Things that could bring them down." Jake's stomach tightened. "What things?" She hesitated, her gaze flickering to the man who had let them in. He gave a slight nod, a silent permission for her to speak. She took a deep breath and began. "They've been manipulating entire civilizations for years," Silara explained, her voice steady but laced with emotion. "They've been using technology to control minds, to influence leaders, to twist events in their favor. They have spies everywhere, controlling the flow of information, And they'd been doing this without anyone knowing, until now. Jake's mind spun. He had heard whispers of corruption, of powerful organizations pulling the strings behind the scenes. But this was something on an entirely different level. It wasn't just a matter of politics or greed. It was control, absolute control over entire worlds. "So you came back to stop them?" Jake asked, his voice low with disbelief. "To bring them down." Solara nodded slowly. "I couldn't live with myself if I didn't try. I've seen the horrors they've committed, the lives they've destroyed, and I couldn't be a part of it anymore. So I ran. And now, they're hunting me down to make sure I don't expose them." Jake felt the weight of her words settle over him. The idea of someone, or something, having that much power, controlling entire civilizations without anyone realizing. It was hard to wrap his mind around. And yet, everything inside him told him that Solara wasn't lying. The fear in her eyes was too real. The urgency in her voice was too clear. But the question remained, what was Jake supposed to do with all of this? He turned to the man who had opened the door. "And you? Who are you?" The man gave a short laugh, though it was devoid of humor. "We're a resistance," he said simply. "We've been fighting back against them for years. We're small, scattered, and we don't have much, but we're not going to give up. Not now. Not ever." Jake's mind raced. A resistance. They had been fighting against this shadow empire, hidden from the public eye, trying to stop a force far greater than anything he could have imagined. He had never asked for this. He wasn't part of any rebellion. He was just a guy trying to survive in a broken world. But now, as he stood there, listening to the weight of Solara's words and feeling the palpable tension in the room, something inside him shifted. He couldn't walk away from this. He couldn't leave her alone in the face of something so enormous. He didn't know what he could do to help. But he knew that if anyone was going to have a chance against an empire like the one Solara described, it was going to be people like them. People who were willing to fight, even if the odds were stacked against them. "I'm in," Jake said, his voice firm. "I don't know how I can help, but I'll do whatever it takes." Solara looked at him, a flicker of something soft in her eyes. For a moment, the fear that had clouded her face seemed to lessen, and she gave a small nod. "Thank you," she whispered. The man who had let them in nodded too, a small smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "It's not going to be easy," he said, his voice steady. "They'll come for you, Solara. They'll come for all of us. And we'll need everything we have to stop them." Jake felt the weight of those words settle on his shoulders. This wasn't just about one woman running from a powerful empire. This was about a war for the freedom of entire worlds. And it was just beginning. The days that followed were nothing like what Jake had expected. When he had first met Solara, it had been by accident. Now, he found himself entrenched in a fight for survival, running from enemies he barely understood. The world around him had turned upside down, and every step felt like he was getting deeper into something dangerous, something much larger than he could have ever imagined. They were no longer alone in their hideout. Solara had brought him to another part of the city, a place where the resistance had set up a makeshift base. It wasn't much, just a small, abandoned building that they had fortified with whatever they could find. It looked like a war zone, but it was the only place that offered any semblance of safety. The air was thick with tension, and every corner seemed to hold a new threat. Jake could see it in Solara's eyes. She was no longer the calm and collected person he had met days ago. She had changed. The weight of everything, the knowledge of the Empire's reach, the lives lost, and the constant danger they were in, had taken its toll on her. She wasn't just hiding anymore. She was fighting back. And as much as Jake wanted to help, he had no idea how to navigate this new world she had dragged him into. One morning, as the first light of dawn seeped through the cracks in the walls, Solara approached Jake with a look of determination on her face. "We need to move," she said, her voice urgent. "They're coming." Jake's heart skipped a beat. "Who's coming?" "The Empire's soldiers," she replied, her eyes scanning the room like she was expecting them to burst through the door at any moment. "We've been here too long. They've tracked us." Jake's thoughts raced. He had barely had time to process the fact that an Empire was after them, let alone how to defend himself against soldiers that were obviously better equipped, better trained, and far more dangerous than anything he had ever encountered. He was just a regular guy, a mechanic, a guy who never asked for any of this. "Do you have a plan?" Jake asked, his voice low. He was trying to keep calm, but his pulse was racing. Celara nodded, her jaw clenched. "There's a supply depot not far from here. If we can get there, we can find weapons, food, and shelter. It's our best shot." Jake hesitated for a moment. The words sounded simple enough, but he knew the risks. A supply depot wasn't just some safe haven. It was probably crawling with soldiers. The Empire's forces were relentless. He could feel the weight of the decision bearing down on him. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," Jake admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "You don't have a choice," Celara replied, her tone softer now. "We don't have a choice." It wasn't much of a choice, but it was the only one they had. Jake nodded slowly, his mind spinning as he tried to push the fear aside. This wasn't a normal situation. There were no rules, no plans. It was just about surviving. And if he wanted to help Celara, he had to step up. The resistance fighters had already begun preparing for the move. They were packing what little gear they had, checking weapons, and gathering supplies. The air was tense, and Jake could hear the whispers of concern as people exchanged quick, hushed words. Celara was already gathering her things, her focus sharp. She wasn't wasting any time. Within an hour, they were on the move, sneaking through the narrow alleys of the city, staying hidden from sight. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest. He had never been involved in anything like this before. The closest he had come to danger was a fender bender, not a full-on battle with an Empire. But now, every step felt like a step deeper into something far darker than he had imagined. They kept moving swiftly, trying to blend into the shadows as much as possible. Jake's eyes darted from side to side, scanning the area for any sign of trouble. His hand was wrapped tightly around the small blaster that Celara had given him. He had no idea how to use it, but the weight of it in his hand gave him a strange sense of security, even if it was a false one. It didn't take long before they reached the supply depot. It was an old warehouse, its faded sign barely visible in the dim light of the early morning. The building looked abandoned, but Jake knew better. He knew that it wasn't just a warehouse. It was a key position for the Resistance, and it was also a prime target for the Empire. Celara motioned for them to stop as they approached the door. She pressed her ear against the cold metal surface, listening intently. After a few moments, she gave a quick nod and turned the handle. They slipped inside quietly as the rest of the Resistance fighters took their positions, covering all exits and waiting for orders. Jake stayed close to Celara, watching as she scanned the room. There was something about the way she moved now. Her every step was calculated, deliberate. The fear that had clouded her when they first met was gone. She was in control, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of awe. But the moment didn't last long. Just as they were about to make their way deeper into the warehouse, a sharp noise broke the silence. Jake's heart froze as he heard the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the concrete floor. "Get down," Celara hissed, pulling him into the nearest alcove. They crouched low, hidden from view. Jake's breath caught in his throat as he strained his ears, listening for any sign of the soldiers. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and he could hear the faint murmur of voices. The Empire's soldiers were here, and they were searching for them. Celara motioned for everyone to stay silent, her eyes narrowing as she observed the situation. Jake's pulse raced in his ears. He had no idea how they were going to make it out of this. They were outnumbered and outgunned. The Empire's soldiers had high-tech weapons, and the Resistance fighters were barely equipped with anything that could match that firepower. A sudden burst of gunfire shattered the silence, echoing through the warehouse. The Empire had found them. The fight had begun. Jake's heart pounded as the sounds of battle filled the air. He could hear the resistance fighters firing back, but the enemy's fire was relentless. It wasn't just gunshots. It was the sound of destruction, of buildings collapsing under the weight of superior firepower. Jake's body tensed, and he felt the adrenaline surge through him. This was real. This was war. He glanced at Solara, who was already on the move, her hand signaling for him to follow. She didn't hesitate, darting from cover to cover with swift precision. Jake followed, his feet moving before he could think. He didn't know where he was going, but he trusted her instincts. She knew how to survive in this hellhole. And right now, that was all that mattered. The battle raged on around them as they navigated the maze of crates and debris. The sounds of gunfire, explosions, and shouts grew louder, and Jake's nerves were on edge. He was just a regular guy. He wasn't trained for this kind of fight. But as he followed Solara, he realized something. He couldn't afford to be just a bystander anymore. He had to fight. He had to survive. For Solara, for the resistance, and for himself. They finally reached a narrow stairway leading to the second floor of the warehouse. Solara motioned for Jake to follow her up. They needed higher ground to gain an advantage. As they ascended the stairs, Jake's mind raced. They were in the middle of a war zone. The odds of surviving this were slim. But for the first time since this nightmare began, Jake felt something stir inside him. A sense of purpose. He wasn't just hiding anymore. He was fighting back. And if they were going to survive, they had to stick together. Because in this battle for survival, they were all that each other had. The night passed in uneasy silence, but the sense of urgency had grown stronger with each passing hour. Jake and Lyra sat quietly, surrounded by the remnants of the once bustling garage that had been their safe haven. The walls, now lined with makeshift barricades, barely protected them from the looming threat. The alien forces were closing in, and they both knew that time was running out. Jake's mind raced as he thought of all the possibilities, but none of them seemed promising. They had been running, hiding, and dodging for so long, but now there was no place left to hide. The next day, the final battle would come. They couldn't escape this time. No matter how much they wanted to flee, there was nowhere safe. "We don't have much time left," Jake said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "We can't keep running forever." Lyra nodded, her eyes intense as she examined the various pieces of alien technology scattered across the garage. She was always calm under pressure, but Jake could see the weight of the situation in her eyes. She knew what was at stake. "We need to make our stand," Lyra replied, her voice steady but resolute. "We can't just hide anymore. If we want to survive, we need to fight." Jake's heart sank. The thought of fighting against the alien forces, knowing how outmatched they were, terrified him. But he also knew that Lyra was right. They couldn't afford to back down now. The only option was to hold the line and hope for a miracle. They had the element of surprise on their side. The cloaking devices they had stolen from the alien ship were their best chance at staying hidden long enough to get in a few strikes. With them, they could blend into their surroundings and take out enemy soldiers without being detected. But they couldn't rely on the cloaking devices for long. The alien forces had technology far superior to anything they had ever seen. They would adapt quickly. "Do you think we can pull it off?" Jake asked, trying to mask his fear. Lyra gave him a determined look. "We don't have a choice." The two of them worked quickly, setting up their defenses around the garage. They reinforced the doors and windows with whatever they could find, piling crates and metal sheets against the walls. The garage, once a simple workspace for Jake, had now become their last line of defense. As the day wore on, the faint hum of alien ships grew louder in the distance, sending chills down Jake's spine. In the early afternoon, the sky above them suddenly darkened, and Jake knew what was coming. The orbital bombardment had begun. From the garage's small window, they could see the flashes of bright light streaking across the sky. The air shook with the force of the explosions. Jake felt his stomach drop. The bombs fell with terrifying precision, hitting everything in their path. He could feel the vibrations of each explosion, even from inside the garage. It was only a matter of time before the bombs reached them. The question wasn't whether they'd survive. It was how long they could hold out. "Get ready," Lyra said, her voice tight with determination. "We have to make every shot count." Jake nodded, gripping the alien rifle that Lyra had given him. He had no idea how to use it effectively, but he trusted her. He had to. They didn't have time for second-guessing. As the explosions continued, the sounds of alien soldiers advancing grew closer. Jake's heart was pounding in his chest, and every muscle in his body was on alert. This wasn't just about survival anymore. It was about fighting for each other, for their future, for a chance to live beyond this war. Lyra activated the cloaking devices, and in an instant, they disappeared from sight. The world around them became a blur as they moved silently through the garage, taking their positions behind their makeshift defenses. Jake felt a cold sweat on his brow, but he forced himself to focus. He couldn't afford to let his fear take over. The garage was small, and they had no idea how many enemies they were facing. They had to be quick. They had to be clever. Through the faint hum of the cloaking devices, Jake could hear the faint rustling of alien soldiers outside. The invaders were close, too close for comfort. Jake's fingers tightened around the rifle as he steadied his breath. The first enemy soldier passed by without noticing them. Jake exhaled slowly, relieved, but he knew this was just the beginning. As the enemy forces closed in, Jake and Lyra took out their first target, one soldier at a time. Each shot was precise, silent, and deadly. They moved like shadows, striking quickly before retreating into the cover of darkness. But they couldn't take down the entire force this way. The soldiers were relentless, and the pressure was mounting. "Jake, move," Lyra shouted as another explosion rocked the ground beneath them. Jake's heart skipped a beat as he realized that the bombings were growing more intense. The alien forces weren't just attacking the city. They were targeting the garage. Suddenly, the garage doors burst open, and a group of alien soldiers stormed in. Jake barely had time to react as one of the soldiers aimed their weapon at him. In a split second, he fired back, narrowly missing the soldier's shoulder. The alien soldier returned fire, and Jake dove behind a nearby crate for cover. "Damn it," he muttered under his breath, trying to steady his aim. Lyra was already moving, her alien weapon glowing brightly as she fired at the advancing soldiers. Each shot she took was calculated, deadly. She wasn't just fighting for survival, she was fighting for revenge. For everything the aliens had done. For the destruction they had caused. For the lives they had taken. But the soldiers weren't backing down. The explosions outside, the blinding light of the bombardment, and the sound of blaster fire all merged into a chaotic symphony of war. Jake's ears were ringing, and he could feel his body growing fatigued. He had never fought like this before, but he wasn't going to stop. Not while Lyra was still fighting. The air was thick with smoke, and Jake's vision was blurred by the constant explosions. It felt like the world around him was collapsing. They were surrounded. There was no way out. Just when he thought all hope was lost, something unexpected happened. A loud crack echoed across the battlefield, and a figure appeared at the entrance of the garage. Jake couldn't believe his eyes. It was a soldier. But not an enemy. "Get down," the soldier shouted, raising his weapon. He was wearing the uniform of an alien military force, but there was something different about him. His movements were more fluid, more human. It was like he didn't belong in the ranks of the enemy. "Who are you?" Lyra shouted over the chaos, disbelief in her voice. "I was one of you," the soldier said, his voice rough. "I was a soldier in the war. I couldn't stand what we were doing anymore. I'm here to help." Without another word, the soldier opened fire on the remaining alien forces, catching them by surprise. The battle shifted in their favor. With the help of this unexpected ally, they managed to take out the remaining soldiers one by one. When the dust settled, Jake and Lyra were left standing, breathing heavily but alive. The soldier, though injured, gave them a small nod of approval. "We did it," Jake said, his voice hoarse. Lyra smiled, her eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it together." The garage was silent now. The sounds of battle had faded, and in the distance, the first rays of sunlight began to break through the dark clouds. It was over. The alien forces had been defeated, and while there was no way to undo the destruction that had been wrought, Jake and Lyra knew they had fought for something bigger than themselves. Together, they had stood against impossible odds. Together, they had won. And in that victory, they had found something priceless: hope for the future. The sounds of battle were gone, replaced by the eerie silence of a world that had just witnessed the end of a war. The once bustling city, now scared by the violence of the alien invasion, lay in ruins behind them. The flickering lights from the distant fires cast long shadows across the landscape as Jake and Lyra walked away from the remnants of the war zone. There was nothing left for them here. The battle had been won, but the cost was high. Their story had already spread. The people of the city knew of their struggle, their fight against the alien forces, and the bond they shared. But while there was a sense of victory in the air, there was no peace to be found. The world had been changed forever, and the shadows of the past hung over them, threatening to tear apart the future they were trying to build. The decision was made quickly. They couldn't stay in the city, not with the eyes of the world upon them. Too many people had witnessed the violence, the chaos, and the final stand that had marked the end of the alien invasion. If they stayed, they'd be constantly reminded of the battle, constantly haunted by what had been lost. They needed to start over, somewhere far away from the war, from the pain. They needed a fresh start. Lyra had grown quiet as they walked, her hand resting gently on her growing belly. Her pregnancy had become a symbol of hope, not just for her and Jake, but for their entire species. She was carrying Jake's child, yes, but she was also carrying the future of both human and alien life. It wasn't just about them anymore. It was about the possibility of a world where their kind could coexist, where love could transcend the boundaries that had once divided them. Jake had never imagined this future. Before meeting Lyra, he had been just a soldier, doing his duty in a world that had long been at war. But now, everything had changed. He had seen the worst of what the aliens could do. He had fought, bled, and nearly died alongside Lyra. And now he was walking away from it all, walking toward a new beginning. "We can make it work," Lyra said softly, breaking the silence between them. Her voice was filled with quiet determination. "We'll find a place, somewhere deep in the wilderness. We can live there, away from everything." Jake glanced at her, his heart swelling with a mixture of love and fear. He knew what she meant. They needed peace. They needed a place where they could rebuild, not just their lives, but their love, their future. "I know we can," Jake replied, his voice steady, though a knot of worry tightened in his chest. The world they were walking into was uncertain. But he wasn't alone anymore. He had Lyra, and that was enough. They continued their journey, walking farther away from the city with each step. The air grew colder as they moved deeper into the wilderness, away from the devastation. It was a place untouched by war, a place where the scars of the past had not yet reached. There, they would find a home. They would find a future. As they walked, Lyra rested her hand on Jake's arm, leaning into him for support. He could feel her warmth, her strength, and it gave him the courage to keep moving forward. There was a time when he had been afraid of the unknown, when he had doubted that they would ever find a way to survive. But now, with Lyra by his side, he felt a sense of peace that he had never known before. They finally reached a small clearing deep in the woods, the tall trees surrounding them like silent sentinels. It was a beautiful place, calm and serene. The sound of the wind rustling through the leaves was the only noise, a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind. Jake and Lyra stood there for a moment, taking it all in. This was their new beginning, a place where they could heal, where they could build a life together, away from the darkness of the past. Lyra sat down on a large rock, her hand still resting on her belly. Jake knelt beside her, his eyes soft as he looked at her. The journey had been long and difficult, but they had made it. They had fought for each other, and now they had a chance to rebuild. "How are you feeling?" Jake asked, his voice filled with concern. Lyra smiled at him, her eyes bright with the promise of a future they would create together. "Stronger every day. The baby, it's growing. I can feel it." Jake reached out, placing his hand gently on hers. "And you? How are you feeling, really?" Lyra paused for a moment, her gaze drifting to the horizon. She could see the sun setting in the distance, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a breathtaking sight. For the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of peace settle over her. The war was over. The fight was behind them. They were safe. "I feel hopeful," she said quietly, her voice filled with emotion. "We've been through so much, Jake, but now we have a chance for something better." Jake nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. He couldn't imagine a life without Lyra, without their child. The future felt uncertain, yes, but he was no longer afraid. Together, they would face whatever came next. They had each other, and that was all that mattered. The days passed slowly as they settled into their new home. The wilderness was beautiful, peaceful, and it offered them a refuge from the chaos that had defined their lives for so long. They spent their days exploring the land, gathering food, and building their future one step at a time. Lyra's pregnancy continued, and with each passing day, she grew stronger. The bond between her and Jake deepened. They shared their dreams for the future, dreams of a life filled with love, with family, with peace. They talked about raising their child in a world free from the shadows of war, a world where their love could flourish without fear. As the weeks went by, Lyra's belly grew rounder, and Jake found himself becoming more and more protective of her. The thought of becoming a father was overwhelming, but it was also a source of excitement. He imagined the future, a future where their child would grow up in this beautiful place, far from the violence and destruction that had defined so much of their past. One evening, as the sun began to set, Jake and Lyra sat together on a large rock overlooking the forest. The sky was painted with shades of pink, purple, and gold. They watched in silence as the world around them seemed to come alive in the fading light. "Do you think our child will be like you?" Jake asked, his voice soft and full of wonder. Lyra smiled, her hand resting gently on her belly. "I think there'll be a little bit of both of us, a bridge between our worlds." Jake chuckled softly. "I hope they take after you. You've been through so much. You're stronger than anyone I've ever known." Lyra looked at him, her eyes filled with warmth and affection. "We've both been through a lot, but we've made it. We've survived." And as the evening wore on, they sat together, hand in hand, gazing into the horizon. The future was unknown, but for the first time in a long time, they weren't afraid. They had each other, they had their love, and they had a child on the way. Human and alien, united by something stronger than the battles they had fought. It was a new beginning, one filled with hope, with promise, and with the belief that anything was possible as long as they faced it together.